Tom Switzer is a research associate from the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. He's also an ABC broadcaster. Tom, good to talk to you tonight.
Good evening, Bev.
How hampered is the fight against ISIS without this kind of clearance that Obama is looking for?
Well, I mean, this is an extraordinarily unique declaration that the President has made today. It's one thing to ask for congressional authority to wage war, but in this case, unlike any of his predecessors, I think, he's actually calling on Congress to limit his ability to wage war. And that goes two ways. One is in terms of how long the troops will be committed, but also to what extent he'll be able to commit ground troops. Now, to the extent that the President gets authorisation from Congress on those key issues, that could severely hamper his or his successors' abilities to wage war in the Middle East.
It seems that you're right, that he wants a bet each way. He wants some capacity to go in on land, but basically doesn't sound like he wants to commit troops back to the region.
Well, you have to remember when Barack Obama won the presidency in 2008, the American people were war-weary, and in many respects I think they still are. And throughout much of his presidency, President Obama has tried to redefine the American role in the world in a way that reflects America's changed circumstances and it recognises the limits to power. And I think that he recognises that if he does commit a serious amount of ground troops to Iraq or indeed to Syria, then that obviously increases the likelihood of casualties. And as we've seen during the course of a long decade of war in both Iraq and in Afghanistan, that cost the United States 7,000 troops in lives, as well as $2 billion in costs. It's expensive, and the American people are war-weary and they don't want to go down that road again.
What is the risks in him saying this kind of thing, given what we've seen rise out of the ashes of the Iraq war?
Well, that's a very good point, Bev. I think the underlying problem in this conflict in Iraq that gave rise to the Islamic State jihadists is this disenfranchised Sunni minority. You have to remember that the Sunnis more or less ran the show in Baghdad for generations, going back to the Ottoman Empire. When Iraq was created after World War I, the Sunnis under the Hashemites, the British, and then of course under the Baathists, basically imposed order and led the country. What the invasion in 2003 did was it overturned that sectarian imbalance so that the majority Shia have been running the show. And for the most part, the Shia leadership has been more interested in seeking revenge against their former tormentors than in building a nation. And the Sunni minority has now originally turned into an insurgency against the American forces after 2003. That has now morphed more or less into a plethora of Sunni jihadist groups, one of which is the Islamic State terrorists. So the big issue here, I think, is how does Baghdad and the Americans help create a consensus in Iraq? Now, all the available evidence indicates that since the downfall of Saddam Hussein, it's been a very problematic issue. It's been very difficult to integrate a lot of the Sunni into the mainstream. And although the current Prime Minister, al-Abadi, who replaced al-Maliki 6 months ago, has made some efforts, there is a great danger that the US-led air campaign is merely reaffirming that potent Sunni narrative since the downfall of Saddam, that the Americans are in cahoots with the Baghdad regime. And let's remember, it's the Shia militia that's supported by not only the Iraqi government but the Iranian government that is scaring the living bejesus out of the Sunnis. The reason why the Islamic State terrorists managed to make so much inroads into the northwestern parts of Iraq 6 months ago is because the Sunnis in those parts of Iraq are more afraid of the Shia militia than the Sunni militia. So, as you can tell, this is a very complicated issue, and a military solution will not fix the problem. It will ultimately have to be a political settlement in Baghdad.
And that seems to be a difficult one for him to enunciate, that in fact this has almost become too hard and that the political solution is the only way forward, perhaps hand in hand with some military. It is difficult for him to enunciate that, isn't it?
Well, it is, and as I say, he recognises one of the lessons of the Iraq War in 2003 is that democracy is clearly not an export commodity to an arbitrarily created state, ethnically and tribally divided society. All the Americans really want is some degree of order across Iraq. Now, I think it's fair to say that the southern part of Iraq, which is predominantly Shia, there's a degree of stability and order there. But the problem now is if the Americans and the Iraqi government are serious about taking out the Islamic State foothold in those northwestern towns of the Anbar province, for example, and other parts of northwest Iraq, Mosul, Fallujah, other towns like that, ground troops will be required, and all the available evidence indicates that the best way of taking out the Sunni jihadists in northwest Iraq is primarily from the Shia militia. And let's be quite frank, the Shia militia have an appalling human rights records. The Americans will have to get in bed with the Shia militia, and that raises all sorts of questions about the moral notion of this enterprise.
Tom, really good to get your insights. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Bev.